Welcome to another boring history for sleep, a place where you can fall asleep fast while drifting through the past. Think of this as a bedtime story, or maybe even a sleep story, where strange and weird history unfolds like a gentle story time session. Some call it extra history, others call it stories for sleep. But here, you can simply relax. Let the day fade and learn history while you sleep. Whether you're looking for a sleep video, deep sleep meditation, or just the calming voice of a sleepless historian guiding you through boring history to sleep, this is your moment to rest. Tonight's tale will be a sleep history unlike any other, a story of power, wealth, and sacrifice, told softly, as if it were always meant to be a bedtime story. Picture this. The year is 1895. Gas lamps glow along the grand avenues of New York City, casting golden halos across polished carriages and towering brownstone mansions. Inside, a ballroom pulses with music, violins swelling, champagne glasses clinking, silk gowns sweeping the marble floors. 100 glittering candles bounce their light off diamonds and tiaras, jewels so large they look almost absurd, their fire visible from across the room. This is the Gilded Age, a time when America's newly rich weren't just wealthy, they were unimaginably, grotesquely, extravagantly wealthy. Families like the Vanderbilts, Astors, Goulds, and Whitneys had fortunes so vast they made European kings look like paupers. Palaces sprouted in Manhattan. Summer cottages in Newport stretched bigger than museums. And every party seemed louder, brighter, and more expensive than the one before. But beneath all that glitter, there was a wound. Something money couldn't buy.
Picture this. You're crawling through 200 miles of wilderness, with your leg bones sticking out, maggots eating your infected wounds, surviving on berries and roots while grizzly bears stalk you. This wasn't a nightmare. This was Tuesday for America's mountain men. These legendary trappers built fortunes in the 1830s. But the stories they never told would shock you to your core. Before we dive into this dark chapter of American history, hit that subscribe button if you're into untold stories that'll keep you up at night. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from and what time is it? I read every single one. And it's wild seeing folks from New York to Nevada staying up late for the same twisted history.
Now, let's journey back to when men vanished into the wilderness for years, and only half of them ever came back alive. The year was 1830, and America had discovered liquid gold flowing through Rocky Mountain streams. We're not talking about actual gold. We're talking about beaver pelts. European fashion had gone absolutely crazy for beaver felt hats, and suddenly every stream in the American West became a potential fortune that men would die for. The numbers were staggering beyond belief. A skilled mountain man could pull in 400 to 500 pounds of beaver pelts annually, selling them for $4 to $6 per pound. That's equivalent to about $15,000 to $20,000 in today's money. Serious wealth for men who started with nothing but a rifle, a dream, and a death wish. Companies like the American Fur Company recruited hundreds of trappers, promising riches beyond imagination. Their advertisements painted pictures of adventure and easy money, conveniently leaving out the parts about freezing to death, getting scalped, or being eaten alive by grizzly bears. Towns like St. Louis became launching points for expeditions that would disappear into the wilderness for months, sometimes years. The lucky ones came back wealthy. The unlucky ones never came back at all. But here's what the recruitment posters never mentioned. The mountains were a killing field disguised as opportunity, and the body count was about to get astronomical. Mountain men faced dangers that would make modern extreme sports look like children's games. Grizzly bears weren't just animals. They were 800-pound death machines with claws longer than kitchen knives that could crack a human skull like an egg. These bears had no fear of humans and would actively hunt them down. Hypothermia claimed more lives than bullets, turning strong men into frozen corpses in their sleep. Starvation turned healthy trappers into walking skeletons who would eat their own moccasins, leather clothing, and eventually resort to cannibalism to survive.
Disease was perhaps the cruelest killer of all. Mountain fever, dysentery, and infections had no mercy in a world without medicine. Men would watch their companions waste away over weeks, knowing they could be next. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, no hope except what you could carry in your possible bag. A simple cut could turn gangrenous and require amputation with nothing but a hunting knife and whiskey for anesthesia. Native American tribes, protecting their ancestral hunting grounds, launched devastating attacks on trespassing trappers. The Blackfoot Confederation was particularly ruthless, considering mountain men invaders who deserved no mercy. They would torture captured trappers for days, using techniques that would make medieval executioners cringe. Entire trapping parties would disappear without a trace, leaving only scattered bones and abandoned campsites as evidence they ever existed.
And then there were the psychological casualties that nobody talks about. Men who survived physically but lost their minds to the endless brutality. This brings us to the most infamous mountain man story ever recorded. Hugh Glass and the grizzly attack that should have ended everything, but instead revealed the true horror of what survival actually cost. August 1823, somewhere in present-day South Dakota. Hugh Glass was scouting ahead of his party when he stumbled into a nightmare scenario. A massive grizzly bear protecting her cubs. What happened next defied every law of human survival and created a legend that would haunt the frontier for generations. The bear attacked with prehistoric fury. Glass tried to fight back with his knife, but the grizzly was unstoppable. She ripped open his scalp, exposing bone. Her claws shredded his back to ribbons, breaking ribs and puncturing his lung. She bit chunks of flesh from his shoulder and leg, breaking his leg bone so severely it stuck out through the skin. When she was finished, Glass lay in a pool of his own blood, more dead than alive.
His companions, John Fitzgerald and Jim Bridger, were certain Glass was dying. They could hear his rattling breath, see the massive blood loss, smell the infection already setting in. They had to keep moving or risk their own lives to Arikara war parties. It was brutal frontier logic. Sacrifice one to save many. They took his rifle, his knife, his gear, and left him for dead with just the clothes on his back. But Hugh Glass refused to die, and what came next was worse than death. With maggots literally cleaning his infected wounds and only wild berries for food, Glass began crawling. Not crawling for help, crawling 200 miles to Fort Kiowa. He set his own broken leg, using dead branches as splints, screaming in agony with no one to hear. He fought off wolves, trying to steal a buffalo carcass he scavenged, eating raw meat that made him violently sick. He floated down rivers on makeshift rafts, his body shutting down from blood loss and starvation, hallucinating conversations with dead friends.
For 6 weeks, Glass crawled through hell. His fingernails wore down to bloody stumps from clawing across rocks. His body consumed its own muscle tissue to survive. He caught and ate snakes, insects, anything that moved. When infection set in, he used maggots to eat the dead flesh, knowing it was the only thing keeping him from dying of gangrene. 6 weeks later, Glass stumbled into Fort Kiowa, more dead than alive. His survival story spread like wildfire across the frontier, but it also revealed something terrifying about mountain life. Sometimes living was worse than dying, and survival came with a price that destroyed men's souls. What Glass never talked about publicly were the nightmares that plagued him for the rest of his life. The way he'd wake up screaming, thinking he was still crawling through that wilderness. The paranoia that made him unable to trust anyone ever again. Modern psychology would recognize this as severe PTSD, but in 1823, broken men were expected to just keep going or get out of the way. But Glass's story was just the beginning of the darkness that consumed the mountain men. The mountain men's relationship with Native American tribes created a constant state of warfare that most history books gloss over, preferring sanitized versions that don't show the true brutality on both sides. The Blackfoot Confederation had declared total war on American trappers, viewing them as thieves stealing resources that belonged to indigenous peoples. They weren't wrong. Mountain men were systematically depleting beaver populations that tribes had sustainably harvested for generations, destroying entire ecosystems for European fashion trends. The Arikara War of 1823 saw coordinated attacks on trapping expeditions that turned the Missouri River into a highway of death. Entire companies were wiped out in dawn raids that lasted for hours. Scalping wasn't just about killing enemies, it was psychological warfare designed to terrorize survivors into abandoning the mountains forever. But the torture techniques went far beyond scalping.
Captured trappers were subjected to ritualized torture that could last for days. They would be slowly burned alive piece by piece. Their fingers and toes would be cut off one at a time. Hot coals would be placed on their bodies while they were still alive. Some were skinned alive and left to die slowly. The screams could be heard for miles, serving as warnings to other trappers. Trappers responded with equal brutality that revealed the darkness in their own souls. They formed armed militias and launched preemptive strikes on tribal villages, killing women and children indiscriminately. They poisoned water sources used by tribes. They spread diseases intentionally through infected blankets. The Rocky Mountains became a war zone where mercy was a luxury nobody could afford. Jedediah Smith, one of the most famous mountain men, survived multiple attacks, but watched dozens of companions die in brutal frontier conflicts. His expeditions left trails of graves across the American West, markers of men who gambled their lives for beaver pelts and lost everything. Smith himself was scalped twice and lived, bearing horrific scars that reminded him daily of the violence that defined his world.
The stories of survival often included details too graphic for polite society. Cannibalism during harsh winters when men ate their dead companions to survive. Amputations performed without anesthesia, using red-hot knives. Men driven insane by isolation and constant fear, who would talk to imaginary companions for months. Mountain men developed their own brutal code of justice. Theft was punishable by death. Cowardice could get you abandoned in the wilderness. Betrayal meant torture before execution. They lived by rules that civilized society would consider barbaric. But in the mountains, civilization's rules meant death. Then came the collapse that nobody saw coming, destroying an entire way of life and leaving broken men scattered across a continent.
By 1840, the mountain man era was effectively over, killed not by violence but by economics and fashion. European fashion had moved on from beaver felt hats to silk alternatives. The Industrial Revolution provided cheaper substitutes for everything beaver fur could do. Beaver populations had been trapped to near extinction across vast regions, with some areas completely depleted. The price per pelt crashed from $6 to barely $1, making the deadly profession economically worthless. Men who had spent decades in the wilderness found themselves unemployed and unemployable overnight. Their specialized skills, tracking animals across hundreds of miles, surviving in temperatures that killed most men, reading weather patterns like books, had no value in civilized society. They were living fossils from a world that no longer existed.
The economic collapse hit like a natural disaster. Trappers who had invested years building trap lines, establishing relationships with traders, learning the mountain's secrets, suddenly found their expertise worthless. Some tried to transition to other work, but most couldn't adapt to the regimented life of towns and cities. Many became scouts and guides for westward expansion, but their knowledge was quickly replaced by established trails and railroad surveys. Others tried farming, but men accustomed to complete freedom couldn't tolerate the routine of agricultural life. Some opened trading posts, but competition from established businesses usually drove them out.
But the saddest cases were those who simply vanished. They walked back into the mountains they knew so well and were never seen again. Whether they chose isolation, met violent ends, or simply couldn't survive without the beaver trade remains a mystery that haunts Western history. Entire camps were found empty, with no signs of violence, suggesting men had simply walked away from everything. The few who stayed in civilization often struggled with alcoholism and violence, unable to process the trauma they'd experienced or adapt to society's constraints after years of absolute freedom. The psychological toll of mountain life created walking ghosts, men whose bodies survived but whose minds never left the wilderness, forever trapped between two worlds that no longer made sense. James Beckworth, who lived among the Crow tribe for years, struggled with identity crisis that modern psychology would recognize as dissociative disorder. Was he white? Was he Crow? Was he mountain man or civilized citizen? The mountains had stripped away his original identity and replaced it with something that fit nowhere in civilized society. He would switch between personalities depending on his audience, never sure which version of himself was real. Kit Carson, perhaps the most famous mountain man who successfully transitioned to civilization, privately struggled with depression and nightmares until his death. Even successful adaptation came with invisible scars that never fully healed. He would wake up in cold sweats, reaching for weapons that weren't there, expecting attacks that never came.
Many mountain men became severe alcoholics, using whiskey to numb memories too painful to process sober. They would drink themselves unconscious rather than face the nightmares that came with sleep. Others developed what we now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, hypervigilance, paranoia, inability to sleep indoors or with their backs to doors. They'd spent so many years expecting death at any moment that peace felt unnatural, dangerous. The constant violence had rewired their brains for survival in conditions that no longer existed. They couldn't turn off the fight-or-flight response that had kept them alive in the mountains. Every unexpected noise sent them reaching for knives. Every stranger was a potential enemy. Every closed space felt like a trap.
Some committed suicide rather than face life in towns that felt like prisons after the unlimited freedom of the mountains. The very independence that made them legendary also made them incapable of accepting society's constraints. They would rather die free than live as what they saw as slaves to civilization. Others simply snapped under the psychological pressure. They would have violent episodes, attacking innocent people they perceived as threats. Some were institutionalized in the crude mental hospitals of the era. Others were simply locked up or run out of town, left to wander as broken outcasts. The mountain men who tried to tell their stories found that civilized audiences didn't want to hear the truth. They wanted romantic adventures, not accounts of cannibalism and torture. So the men learned to lie, to sanitize their experiences, to hide the darkness that defined their lives. But the darkness was always there, eating away at them from the inside. The environmental destruction caused by mountain men was catastrophic and largely hidden from history books that prefer to focus on human drama rather than ecological disaster. Beaver populations across the American West were driven to near extinction in less than 2 decades. These weren't just animals being killed. Beavers were keystone species whose dams created entire ecosystems. When the beavers disappeared, their wetlands dried up, fish populations collapsed, bird species lost their nesting grounds, and entire food chains disintegrated. The mountain men knew they were destroying the resource that sustained them, but the immediate profits were too tempting to resist. They trapped pregnant females and juveniles, wiped out entire colonies, and moved on to new areas when the old ones were exhausted. It was environmental strip mining, disguised as individual enterprise. Native American tribes watched in horror as ecosystems their ancestors had carefully managed for thousands of years were destroyed in a single generation. The sustainable hunting practices that had maintained balance for millennia were replaced by industrial-scale extraction that left wastelands behind. Rivers that had run clear for centuries became polluted with the chemicals used in pelt processing. Mercury used to treat furs contaminated water sources and poisoned wildlife. The mountain men didn't understand the long-term consequences, but they were creating environmental damage that would last for generations. The trails they blazed became highways for further destruction. What started as narrow paths for individual trappers became routes for wagon trains, cattle drives, and eventually railroads that brought industrial-scale resource extraction to the wilderness. But perhaps the most devastating environmental impact was cultural, the destruction of indigenous knowledge about sustainable land management that had developed over thousands of years. When tribes were displaced or destroyed, that knowledge died with them, leaving behind a continent that would be managed by people who didn't understand its natural systems.
The mountain men themselves became part of this environmental destruction, their own culture consumed by the same forces that destroyed the wilderness they claimed to love. Now, let's talk about the diseases and medical horrors the mountain men faced, details so graphic that most historical accounts skip over them entirely. Scurvy was common among trappers who went months without fresh vegetables or fruit. Their teeth would fall out, their gums would bleed constantly, old wounds would reopen spontaneously, men would slowly waste away as their bodies literally fell apart from malnutrition.
Venereal diseases spread rapidly through mountain communities with no effective treatments available. Syphilis would drive men insane in its later stages, causing hallucinations, violent behavior, and eventually death. Many mountain men died raving mad from diseases contracted years earlier. Frostbite was so common it was considered routine. Men would lose fingers, toes, hands, or feet to the cold, then continue working with improvised prosthetics. The sight of trappers with missing digits was so normal that it barely drew comment. Some men lost their noses or ears to frostbite, leaving them horribly disfigured.
Infected wounds were death sentences without proper medical care. A simple cut from a beaver trap could lead to gangrene that required amputation with crude tools and no anesthesia. Men would hold leather straps between their teeth while their companions sawed off infected limbs with hunting knives heated in campfires. Dysentery killed more mountain men than bullets or bear attacks. The constant diarrhea and dehydration would weaken men until they couldn't continue. Then they would be left behind to die alone. The disease spread rapidly through camps where sanitation was primitive and clean water was often unavailable.
Mountain fever, probably typhus, would strike entire expeditions. Men would burn with fever while shaking uncontrollably, hallucinating enemies and monsters. Those who survived were often left with permanent brain damage that affected their judgment and behavior for the rest of their lives. Broken bones were common, but almost never healed properly. Men would set their own fractures using whatever materials were available: sticks, leather strips, even strips of metal from broken traps. The results were often deformed limbs that caused constant pain but allowed basic function.
Eye injuries from flying wood chips, ice, or thorns frequently left men partially or completely blind. Depth perception was crucial for survival in the mountains, so partial blindness often became a death sentence. Some men developed primitive eye patches from leather scraps, becoming the source of pirate-like imagery in later folklore. Dental problems were epidemic among mountain men. Without proper care, teeth would rot away, leaving men unable to chew the tough jerky and pemmican that formed their basic diet. Some would pull their own teeth with pliers or knives, then fashion crude replacements from carved wood or bone. But the most horrifying medical reality was the primitive surgery that mountain men performed on themselves and each other. Self-surgery was not uncommon when medical help was hundreds of miles away. Men would cut out their own bullets using hunting knives and crude mirrors. They would lance their own abscesses, drain infected wounds, and perform amputations on themselves when gangrene set in. Arrow removal was a specialized skill that could mean the difference between life and death. Barbed arrowheads couldn't be pulled straight out. They had to be pushed completely through the body and pulled out the other side. Men would perform this surgery on conscious patients with no anesthesia beyond whiskey. The psychological trauma of performing and receiving such primitive medical care added another layer of horror to mountain life. Men would have nightmares about the surgeries they'd witnessed or performed. The screams of patients undergoing amputation without anesthesia haunted survivors for years. Some mountain men became skilled at primitive medicine through necessity, but their techniques would horrify modern doctors. They used maggots to clean infected wounds, cauterized bleeding with red-hot metal, and performed crude trepanation to relieve pressure from head injuries. The constant exposure to blood, gore, and human suffering desensitized mountain men to violence in ways that changed their fundamental humanity. The stories mountain men told about their adventures were carefully sanitized versions of experiences too brutal for civilized audiences to comprehend.
When mountain men returned to civilization, they faced audiences hungry for adventure stories, but unprepared for the reality of frontier life. So they learned to lie creatively, turning horror stories into tall tales that entertained rather than traumatized their listeners. Real encounters with grizzly bears became heroic battles where brave men triumphed through skill and courage, leaving out the parts about companions being eaten alive while they listened helplessly. Starvation became challenges overcome through clever hunting, omitting the cannibalism that actually kept them alive.
Conflicts with Native American tribes became exciting battles between civilized men and savage enemies, ignoring the complex political and economic factors that drove the violence, and definitely not mentioning the atrocities committed by both sides. The mountain men themselves began to believe their own sanitized versions after telling them so many times. The human mind has ways of protecting itself from unbearable memories, and creating heroic narratives was one way these men coped with experiences that would have broken most.
But late at night, when the whiskey wore off and the nightmares came, they remembered what really happened. They remembered the friends who died screaming. They remembered eating human flesh to survive. They remembered the innocent people they killed in raids that served no purpose beyond revenge. Some mountain men tried to tell the truth, but found that audiences didn't want reality. They wanted entertainment. So the truth was buried beneath layers of mythology that transformed broken men into romantic heroes and environmental destruction into manifest destiny.
The few written accounts that survived were heavily edited by publishers who understood that the public wanted adventure stories, not psychological horror. The real diaries and letters of mountain men, when they could write at all, told very different stories that remained hidden in archives for generations. This systematic distortion of history created the romantic mythology that still surrounds the mountain man era, hiding the brutal reality beneath layers of Hollywood fantasy. The economic impact of the mountain man era extended far beyond the fur trade itself, creating ripple effects that shaped American development in ways that few people understand.
The beaver trade was one of America's first extractive industries, establishing patterns of resource exploitation that would be repeated with gold, silver, timber, and oil. The mountains taught American capitalism that natural resources were there to be taken as quickly as possible with no thought for sustainability or long-term consequences. The wealth generated by beaver pelts helped finance westward expansion and industrial development in eastern cities. New York and Boston banking houses built fortunes on fur trade profits, then invested that money in manufacturing and transportation that drove American economic growth.
But the boom and bust cycle of the beaver trade also established patterns of economic instability that would plague Western development for generations. When the beaver market collapsed, it left behind ghost towns, abandoned infrastructure, and thousands of men with no marketable skills. The mountain men themselves became economic refugees when their industry disappeared overnight. Most had no savings. They'd spent their money as fast as they made it, never imagining that the good times would end. When beaver prices crashed, they were left with nothing but memories and trauma. The social costs were enormous, but largely invisible to Eastern economists who only saw the profits. Broken families, abandoned children, communities destroyed by violence. None of this appeared on any ledger, but the human cost was enormous. The mountain men's legacy also included the destruction of indigenous economies that had sustained Native American tribes for thousands of years. When beaver populations collapsed, tribes lost not just a resource but entire ways of life that had defined their cultures. The environmental destruction caused by overtrapping created economic problems that lasted for generations. When beaver dams disappeared, entire watersheds changed, affecting agriculture, transportation, and settlement patterns across the American West. But perhaps the most significant economic legacy was the establishment of extractive capitalism as the dominant model for Western development. The idea that natural resources existed primarily to generate short-term profits, regardless of long-term consequences, became deeply embedded in American business culture. The mountain men proved that enormous wealth could be extracted from the wilderness, but they also proved that such extraction was ultimately unsustainable. The lesson went unlearned as Americans moved on to destroy other resources with the same short-sighted greed. Let's examine some specific mountain men whose stories revealed the true darkness of this era, men whose real experiences were far more horrifying than any Hollywood movie.
John Colter, often called the first mountain man, survived experiences that should have killed him multiple times. Captured by Blackfoot warriors, he was stripped naked and told to run for his life while they hunted him for sport. He ran barefoot across rocky terrain for miles, his feet bleeding and torn, while arrows flew past his head. When he finally escaped by hiding underwater in a beaver pond, he emerged to find himself hundreds of miles from any help, naked and without weapons in the middle of winter. What the history books don't tell you is what happened to Colter's mind after that experience. He became paranoid and violent, unable to sleep without weapons within reach, jumping at every unexpected sound. He would wake up screaming from nightmares about being chased. The psychological trauma destroyed his ability to form normal relationships, and he died alone and largely forgotten.
Jim Bridger survived in the mountains for over 40 years, but the cost was horrific. He was shot with arrows so many times that metal points remained embedded in his body for years. One arrowhead stayed lodged near his spine for 3 years before it was finally removed by a doctor at a rendezvous. During that time, he lived with constant pain and the knowledge that one wrong movement could paralyze or kill him. Bridger also survived multiple encounters with grizzly bears that left him scarred and partially disabled. One attack damaged his shoulders so severely that he never regained full use of his left arm. Another bear attack left deep scars across his face that made him grotesque to civilized observers. Children would run away when they saw him, and adults would stare in horror at his disfigured features.
But the worst part of Bridger's story was watching his companions die around him year after year. He outlived dozens of partners, friends, and employees, each death adding to the psychological burden he carried. By the end of his life, he was one of the few survivors of an entire generation of mountain men, carrying memories of violence and death that haunted him until his final breath. Joe Meek was another long-term survivor whose experiences illustrate the brutal reality of mountain life. He was present at multiple massacres where entire trapping parties were wiped out by hostile tribes. At one massacre along the Salmon River, he watched as his companions were tortured to death over several days while he hid in nearby rocks, unable to help without guaranteeing his own death.
Meek later described hearing his friends' screams echo across the canyon as they were slowly burned alive, their agony lasting for hours. The psychological impact of witnessing such horrors while being powerless to intervene destroyed something fundamental in his humanity. He became callous and violent, capable of cruelty that matched anything he had witnessed. The story of Thomas Fitzpatrick reveals another dark aspect of mountain man psychology. Known as broken hand after a rifle accident mangled his left hand, Fitzpatrick survived numerous attacks and hardships that would have killed most men. But success came at the cost of his ability to trust or love anyone. Fitzpatrick watched 3 wives die from diseases, violence, or the hardships of frontier life. Each loss made him more emotionally withdrawn until he became incapable of forming deep human connections. He treated relationships as temporary conveniences rather than meaningful bonds because experience had taught him that everyone he cared about eventually died in horrible ways. These men weren't heroes. They were survivors of a system that destroyed human beings as efficiently as it destroyed beaver populations. Their stories reveal the true cost of America's westward expansion, measured not in dollars, but in damaged souls. Many mountain men developed a fatalistic philosophy that bordered on nihilism. They believed that life was essentially meaningless suffering, punctuated by brief moments of pleasure or success. Death was random and unavoidable, so the only rational response was to accept whatever came without complaint. Others developed a kind of nature mysticism that saw the wilderness itself as a deity, beautiful, terrible, and completely indifferent to human welfare. They worshipped the mountains, not out of love, but out of fear and respect for forces beyond human control or comprehension. Some mountain men had genuine mystical experiences brought on by extreme physical and psychological stress. Starvation, hypothermia, and sleep deprivation can cause hallucinations that feel more real than normal consciousness. Men would report conversations with dead friends, visions of future events, or encounters with supernatural beings that guided them to safety.
These experiences were so common that mountain men developed their own folklore about spirits, omens, and supernatural guidance. They would make offerings to mountain spirits, follow dreams and visions as seriously as they followed maps, and develop elaborate rituals for dealing with death and danger. But the most common spiritual response was a kind of angry atheism that rejected any notion of divine justice or meaning. Men who had seen innocent people suffer and evil people prosper concluded that there was no God, or if there was, he didn't care about human welfare. This spiritual crisis added another layer of isolation to men who were already cut off from civilization. They couldn't share their religious doubts with family members back east who still believed in traditional Christianity. They became spiritual orphans, cut off from both civilization and traditional faith. The combination of physical trauma and spiritual crisis created a unique form of madness that affected many long-term mountain men. They would swing between extreme fatalism and desperate superstitions, between denial of any higher power and frantic attempts to appease supernatural forces they couldn't understand. Some mountain men became convinced that they were cursed or chosen by dark forces. They would interpret every misfortune as supernatural punishment and every success as demonic bargaining. This paranoid spirituality made them even more isolated from normal human society. The violence that mountain men witnessed and participated in created lasting trauma that most historical accounts ignore or minimize. Mountain men weren't just witnesses to violence. They were active participants in cycles of brutality that escalated beyond any rational purpose. Raids led to counter-raids. Massacres led to revenge massacres, until entire regions became war zones where survival depended on striking first and showing no mercy. The psychological impact of committing violence was often worse than being a victim of it. Men who had killed in cold blood found that the act changed them permanently, making normal human relationships impossible. They would see potential enemies everywhere, interpret innocent actions as threats, and respond with lethal force to situations that required diplomacy. Many mountain men became addicted to violence in the same way others became addicted to alcohol or gambling. The adrenaline rush of combat, the sense of power that came from taking life, and the simplified worldview where problems were solved through superior firepower became psychologically necessary for men who couldn't cope with complexity or ambiguity. The dehumanization that made extreme violence possible also made normal society unbearable. Men who had learned to see enemies as less than human couldn't easily reverse that psychological conditioning when they returned to civilization. They remained trapped in warrior mindset long after the wars were over. Some mountain men developed elaborate justifications for their violent actions, creating mythologies that portrayed themselves as defenders of civilization against savage enemies. These narratives helped them sleep at night, but they also prevented them from acknowledging the full horror of what they had done. Others went in the opposite direction, developing an almost pathological guilt that consumed their mental energy. They would obsess over past actions, replay violent encounters in their minds, and torture themselves with thoughts of victims they had killed. This psychological self-punishment often led to suicide or self-destructive behavior. The most damaged mountain men alternated between these extremes, sometimes justifying their actions and sometimes being overwhelmed by guilt. They became unstable and unpredictable, capable of sudden violence or complete emotional breakdown, depending on their psychological state at any given moment. This trauma was never treated or even acknowledged by the society that had sent these men into the wilderness. They were expected to reintegrate into normal life without support, understanding, or recognition of what they had endured and done. The family relationships of mountain men reveal another dimension of the human cost of frontier life that rarely appears in popular histories.
Most mountain men came from families that never fully understood what had happened to their sons, husbands, or brothers in the wilderness. Letters home, when they were written at all, contained sanitized accounts that bore little resemblance to reality. Families were left to imagine adventures that were nothing like the brutal experiences their loved ones actually endured. Many mountain men never returned home, leaving families to wonder for decades whether they were alive or dead. The uncertainty was often worse than confirmed death, as families couldn't grieve properly or move on with their lives. Some waited years for men who had died long before, their bones scattered across remote valleys. The mountain men who did return found that they no longer fit into the families they had left behind. They had become strangers to their own relatives, changed by experiences that couldn't be explained or understood by people who had never left civilized society.
Children often didn't recognize fathers who had been gone for years. Wives had adapted to life without their husbands and found that the men who returned were not the same people who had left. The psychological distance created by years of extreme experience often proved unbridgeable. Some mountain men started new families in the wilderness, taking Native American wives and having children who would grow up between two worlds. These relationships were often practical arrangements rather than romantic partnerships, based on mutual survival needs rather than emotional connection. The children of these unions faced particular challenges, belonging fully to neither white nor Native American society. They often inherited their father's psychological damage while also dealing with cultural displacement that left them rootless and confused about their identity. Many mountain men abandoned these wilderness families when they returned to civilization, leaving behind wives and children who had depended on them for survival. The casual cruelty of these abandonments reveals how thoroughly the frontier experience had destroyed normal human empathy in many of these men. The women who became involved with mountain men, whether as wives, companions, or casual partners, paid a particularly heavy price for association with men who had been psychologically shattered by their experiences. Native American women who married mountain men often found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties when violence erupted between their tribes and their husbands' people. They were forced to choose sides in conflicts where both choices meant betraying people they cared about. These women often faced violence from both communities, rejected by their birth families for associating with enemies, and mistrusted by white communities who saw them as potential spies or threats. They lived in a social limbo that offered neither security nor belonging. The children of these relationships inherited their parents' social displacement, often facing discrimination from both white and Native American communities. They were living symbols of the cultural collision that was destroying traditional ways of life across the American West. Now let's examine the specific ways that mountain men died, because the statistics reveal the true horror of this lifestyle.
Disease killed more mountain men than violence, but the diseases themselves were often related to the extreme conditions they lived in. Pneumonia from constant exposure to cold and wet conditions. Dysentery from contaminated water and poor sanitation. Scurvy from malnutrition during long winters. Infections from untreated wounds that turned septic in unsanitary conditions. Hypothermia and exposure claimed victims every winter, but the deaths were often slow and agonizing rather than quick. Men would gradually lose function as their body temperature dropped, becoming confused and disoriented before losing consciousness. Some were found months later, perfectly preserved by cold, their final expressions showing the terror and desperation of their last moments. Drowning was common during river crossings, especially in spring when snowmelt created raging torrents. Men would be swept away while trying to cross with heavy packs, pulled under by the weight of their gear. Their bodies would often never be recovered, leaving companions to wonder about their fate.
Starvation killed slowly and horribly, especially during harsh winters when game was scarce. Men would gradually consume their own body fat and muscle tissue, becoming walking skeletons before finally collapsing. The psychological impact of watching companions waste away from hunger was often as devastating as the physical suffering. Bear attacks, when they occurred, were usually fatal and always brutal. Grizzly bears would maul victims extensively, often eating them alive while they were still conscious. The few survivors were left horribly disfigured and psychologically traumatized. Most bear attack victims who initially survived died later from infection or blood loss. Violence from hostile tribes was often designed to be as prolonged and painful as possible. Torture techniques included slow burning, skinning alive, and systematic mutilation that could last for days. The screams of torture victims could be.
And perhaps that is why these stories, as old and distant as they may seem, still linger with us. Because in some way, we still know what it feels like to care about how others see us, to polish the outside while keeping parts of ourselves hidden away. But here, in this quiet moment, none of that matters. You are not in a Victorian drawing room. You are not being judged or weighed by invisible eyes. You are safe. You are here, and the world can wait until tomorrow. Let the whispers of the past fade into silence. Let the flicker of the candle go dark. Let the voices of society dissolve into the background, leaving only stillness. Breathe deeply. Release the day. Drift slowly, gently into the soft embrace of sleep. Good night.
The story is finished now. The lights are out. The voices of the past have gone quiet. All that remains is you, your breath, your stillness. Every inhale draws in calm. Every exhale lets go of weight. There is nothing more to think about, nothing more to remember. The day is behind you, You are safe. You are warm. You are allowed to rest. Your body knows what to do. Your eyes grow heavy, heavier, like the velvet curtains closing over a stage that has finished its play. And in that darkness, there is peace. Let your thoughts float like leaves carried gently down a quiet stream. No effort, no destination, just drifting. With every word, your body relaxes deeper. With every silence, you slip further into comfort. You are safe. You are loved. You are at rest. And now, it is time to sleep. Sleep deeply. Sleep peacefully. Sleep fully. Good night.